Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi Shir.
Shalom Aleichem. Welcome back to today's Daf Yomi, which is Maseches MOED KATAN Daf Beis. You know why it's called MOED KATAN? Because this Masechta primarily deals with the halachos of Chol HaMoed. Chol HaMoed, the weekday aspect of your Yom Tov. MOED KATAN, a low level, a low ranking Yom Tov. You know, Rav Chaim Lotzato, in his classic Sefer Derech Hashem, explains that Isser Malacha that we have on Shabbos or Yom Tov aren't just restrictions. Quite the contrary. He explains that in a Shabbos, in a Yom Tov, we have so much Kedusha that's inherent in that day. And in order to really connect to that Kedusha, one has to disengage from the physical aspect of Olam Hazeh. And that's what Isser Malacha accomplishes. It allows us to It affords us the opportunity to disconnect from Olam Hazeh and reconnect to the spiritual realms, to the spiritual aspect that's contained within Shabbos and Yom Tov, to get to that Kedusha. And therefore he explains that the Isser Malachos are commensurate, they parallel the potential Kedusha embedded in that day. The more Kedusha, the more you have to disengage to get to that Kedusha. And therefore, Chol HaMoed, which is really a lower ranking Kedusha, it has Kedusha but not on the same level as your typical day of Yom Tov, we have Isser Malacha, but on a lower flame. We're less restricted. And that still allows us to connect to the Kedusha of this Yom Tov. So it's a lower ranking Kedusha, and therefore it features some restrictions, some disengagement, but not on the same level as your ordinary Shabbos v'Yom Tov. So, what is it that we can or cannot do on Chol HaMoed? Says the Mishnah. Mashkin beis hashalachin b'moed u'b'shviz. You can water a field. Beis hashalachin is a thirsty field, which can't subside just on natural rainfall. You need to constantly, manually water it. And if you'll refrain from watering on Chol HaMoed or Shvita, it's going to go bad. It's going to dry up. You'll lose your field. It's a makom of hefsed. In a case of potential financial loss, Chacham say you can actually do this malacha. You can water your field b'mayid on Chol HaMoed u'b'shvius as well as on Shemitah. Let's go over to Rashi on the side. Some actually say it's not the Rashi, but it's Rabbi Gershom Me'or HaGoyla. In any case, it says the Rashi over here, Mashkin beis hashlachem b'mayid, right on top. So the Sheyemedus Bahar. You have a field situated on a mountain, which I guess is your typical location for this type of field, beis hashalachan, which dries up quickly, which needs to be tended to on a regular basis. You have to water it constantly. You can do it even now. Because otherwise you're going to lose the field. It says Rashi, Chacham allowed a slight tircha, watering a field, if it's to avoid financial loss. You can do it even on Chol HaMoed. Why? I thought Isser Malacha applies to Chol HaMoed. The Gemara Chagiga explains, one pasuk says, Sheishes Yamim Teichel Matzos, Ubayoyim Hashvi Atzeres Hashem Lekecha. So the seventh day, the time for Atzeres, refrain from Malacha, celebrate Yom Tov. And we say just as Ma Shvi'i Atzor B'Asiris Malacha, the pasuk connects the 6 to the 7. Just as day 7 is Atzor B'Malacha, Avshisha Atzor B'Asiris Malacha. Likewise, throughout the 6 prior days, 6 preceding days, you're meant to refrain from Malacha. Here's the makar for Isser Malacha and Chol HaMoed. Ima Shvi'i Atzor B'Chol Malacha, perhaps just as Shmini Atzeres, actually not Shvi, Yom HaShvi of Pesach has Isser Malacha. It's a true Yom Tov. Av Shisha Asur B'Chol Malacha. Likewise, the previous 6 days feature the same Isser Malacha, which means that even on Chol HaMoed you have the same restrictions as Yom Tov. Talmud Loim, the pasuk says HaShvi. We single out the 7th day. Shvi Atzur B'Chol Malacha. On 7 you refrain from all Malacha. In Shisha Asur B'Chol Malacha, as opposed to the 6 previous days. So which way does it go? On the one hand, we say we connect and compare all the days to each other. because they're all mentioned in the same pasuk. Isser Malacha applies all throughout Yom Tov, whether it's Yom Tov or Chol HaMoed. And we say, no. The true Isser Malacha only applies to the Yom Tov aspect of Yom Tov. First day, the seventh day, but not Chol HaMoed. Apparently, the Torah is granting authority to the Chachamim to use their discretion. Chacham will determine for us the criteria, the guidelines for which malacha is considered asur and which is mutter. Rashi explains, u'malacha sheish behefsid, and therefore when it comes to a malacha which involves potential hefsid, if it is not executed, this field of ours, he desperately needs to be watered. If you don't water him, you're going to lose your crop. In this case, Chacham allowed watering. So Rashi explains for us that really it's based on a pasuk. The pasuk indicates there is Isser Malacha. And the pasuk says, no, there's no Isser Malacha on Chol HaMoed. Hashem grants the Chachamim permission, the authority, to use their Chacham to determine what is mutter and what is asur. And Chacham determine for us when it involves hefsid. You're not trying to create, you're not trying to benefit, you're trying to avoid loss. That's not a true malacha. You're not creating, you're not fashioning. That's a lower level type of situation. You're just avoiding loss. And provided it doesn't involve too much exertion, just watering a field, that's okay. The Ramban adds, he says, there's a chiddush that every malacha which is l'tzorech hamoed, every malacha from which you benefit on Yom Tov is mutar min haTorah. It has a different mahalach than Rashi. So technically, any malacha l'tzorech hamoed is mutar. It's only asur d'Rabbanan. Rabbanan came along and says, you know what? Although typically it's asur d'Rabbanan, but in this case of makam hefsid, it doesn't involve too much work, it's mutar. Continues the Mishnah. So you can do this on Chol HaMoed and on Shvius as well. How can you do it on Shemitah? You're not meant to do Malach on Shemitah. The Gemara will discuss this. So you could water Bein Mimayon Sheyasa B'Tchila. Whether you're using water from a spring which has just recently begun to flow, in which case there is a slight concern that it might collapse on you and you might have to rebuild it, which involves more than just slight tircha. So despite the fact that there is that chashash, we allow it. Bein mimayin sheyasa b'tchila, or using water from a spring which has been flowing for a while, a well-established spring where there's no realistic concern of collapse. So either way, you can water to save your field. Aval in mashkin, you can't water in a manner where it involves great tircha, drawing from puddles, from a deep pit. That's excessive tircha. Nor can you dig those irrigation ditches around your vine to irrigate your vines. So the point here is that you have to follow two. You have to meet two conditions. Number one, it's a circumstance that can involve potential loss. You're just trying to be moinei hefsed. Number two, minimal work. You can't get involved in a tircha yisera. Amma is a flowing stream which they would dig, an amma deep. That's why it was called an amma. You can't go ahead and dig this ditch, batchila, a new ditch on Chol HaMoed. It's too much work. Ubeshvius. On Shemitah there's no concern. You're not plowing. You're not working your field. You're making a water system. Another leniency, another kula they can repair. A fallen amma, even on Chol HaMoed, it's not that much tircha involved. You're just repairing a pre-existing amma. What else do they do on Chol HaMoed? They can repair the pipe system in the streets. This is l'tzerech harabim. That's why it's mutter. Likewise, they can clear them of any blockages. Umasakin sadrachim, they fix the roads. V'tzarachayvus and the squares, the public squares. Ves mikvahs hamayim, they fix up the mikvahs. V'oisin kol tzarchei rabbim, and everything, all the public works they can do a Chol HaMoed. So although it's malacha, it's tircha, l'tzarchei rabbim mitzmut. Umitzayin esakvaros, they mark the graves this way. The Kehanim keep away. V'yotzin aval kilayim, they send out shluchim on Chol HaMoed, check the fields, kilayim inspectors to ensure there's no kilayim. Asks the Gemara. Mishnah says you can water this Beis HaShalochan field, who's desperate for rain, using a recently flowing spring, a veteran spring. Why do you have to spell out both cases? Hashta yishlema. Now you say Mimai Sheyotze Betchila. You can even use water from a fresh spring. The Osel and Puli, where there's a real concern that perhaps it might just collapse on you. It doesn't have much of a track record, which might lead him to do a lot of tircha. We're not concerned about that collapse. Mashkin, you can go ahead and water from that stream. Certainly, Mimai Sheyotze Betchila, using a veteran stream, a stream which has been flowing for a while, to the Osel and Puli, where there's no real concern of collapse. Is there any need to allow it? Why does the Mishnah have to spell out both cases? Once you say you can use a fresh spring, of course an old spring. Amri, the answer is Itzrich, both are needed. Both have a chiddush. Itana mine sheyotze betchila. If the Mishnah would only speak about a fresh spring, you can take that water and water your Beis HaShalach in your thirsty field. Havamina, perhaps I would say, Hacha, in the case of a fresh spring, where there's a slight chance of collapse and having to do extra work. Over here, I would say, let's limit its use. Let's restrict it. It's only in the case of real desperation. Hacha hu de Beis HaShalochan in. In this fresh spring, we say, only use it for a desperate situation, a Beis HaShalochan circumstance. Beis HaBaal, but not a moist field. A Beis HaBaal, which means that it's a field that is sustained by natural means, by rainwater. Mishum dasin and puli. Don't use this water for that field because there's always that chance that it might collapse, in which case you'll be led to do more work. And unless it's really absolutely necessary, like in the Beis HaShalochan, don't use it. So it's only because there's that chance of collapse. We say, limit it to where you really need it. Beis HaShalochan, not Beis HaBaal. But Aval Mayin Shelo Yotze Betchil. Let's say it's an old stream, a veteran, a well-established stream. It's not going anywhere. It's not collapsing on you. The Leos and Puli, there's no concern of collapse. Eva, perhaps in that case, I would say we can use it liberally. Afilu Beis HaBaal Nami. You can use it even for Beis HaBaal, who's not desperate for watering, because all it involves is just watering. There's no concern of malacha, no concern of rebuilding the broken stream. Kamash Shmuel comes in the Mishnah and says, no, there's no difference between this or that stream. We only allow it in a makom of hefsed, as Rashi explained, which is a Beis HaShalochan, which would otherwise wither. It's irrelevant of whether it's a fresh spring, or it's a veteran spring. It's only allowed by Beis HaShalochan in Beis HaBaal loy, only in a Beis HaShalochan, which is desperate for water. So bottom line is, Mashkin Beis HaShalochan is because you're allowed to avoid hefsid. And therefore we say, whether it's a fresh or veteran spring, go ahead and do it. I'm not concerned about extra tircha. But a Beis HaBaal, an established field, he's sustained by rainwater. Don't bother watering him. It's an unnecessary tircha, unnecessary malach. Umay mashma the high Beis HaShalochan lishna de tzachusehi. What do we find that Beis HaShalochan, the word shalochan denotes thirst, a thirsty field. Chsiv by Amalek it says v'ata oyef yageya. You're oyef, you're exhausted. That's how they attacked Umatargiminan. And in the Unclus we have v'at mishalhe v'loy. V'loy means exhausted, and oyef means mishalhe, thirsty. Taisus brings a pasuk that we see oyef means thirsty. K'dechsiv harveisi nevesh ayefa. So ayefa, oyef, mishalhe, and very often we switch the hey and the ches. Rashi says they come from the same point in the throat. So mishal chei mesa shalachan, a thirsty field. Umay mashma dahai beis habal lishna demias fusahi. What do we find that the term beis habal refers to a well-established field, secure. It doesn't need to be watered. The chsiv kiyival bocher besula, as a bocher interacts with a psula, and we interpret it as follows in Targumina. The Targum says, "Arikim kama the mitoisav ulam and psulta," just as the ulam, the bocher, interacts in a as married with a psula. Yisyasfun begavoyich benoyich. Your children, Eretz Yisrael's children, will be well established and secure in Eretz Yisrael. So in any case, we see that Yival, Mitoisav, secure, established, all go together. It's an established field. It doesn't need constant attention. Okay. Continues the Gemara. The mission tells us that a desperate field, Ibes HaShalachan, all thirsty and parched, can be watered. Why? Because to allow Malach Chol HaMoed, you have to meet two conditions. A double criterion. Number one, only b'makam hefsid. Number two, it has to be a slight tircha, not too much work. And that's why the Mishnah says you can only use a stream, a situation which doesn't involve much exertion, as opposed to a puddle, a deep pit that you can't do. So you have to meet two conditions: hefsid and no tircha. Man Tana. Can we find a Tana? Can we put a name to the face, a name to the Shita? Who is this Shita? That both conditions have to be met to allow Malacha and Chol HaMoed. The Pseida in. Only a Pseida allows it. Harvachalei, but just to profit, to benefit, to enhance the growth process, that's not mutter. That's number one. Number two, if you live Makam Pseida, even if you have a Pseida, you only allow limited interaction. Mitrach nami letarchinan. Only a little work, not much tircha. If it's too much tircha, that's also not allowed. So which Tana holds of these two conditions? Amar Rav Huna, I found a Tana. Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov, it's not Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov. Moishchen Seilan, Moishchen Samayim, Meilan Lilan. This is a Mishnah coming up in that Vav. You notice each puddle of water underneath your tree. Now trees need to be constantly watered. It's like a Beis HaShalachan. You can actually draw from one tree to the other. Provided you don't water the entire field, the entire grain field, which is a Beis HaBaal. Here we go. You have a Shita. It's only allowed to maintain growth, to avoid hefsid. That's true. Delight. Certainly, you see, the Rebbe holds you can't just do harvacha. You can't just enhance the growth process. You can't just water any field. Only a tree which needs watering. That's clear. But what about that other condition? It's not mentioned by Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov. What about if it's a makom of hefsid, which allows malacha? What about if it involves a lot of exertion, a lot of tircha? Is that a problem? It's not clear. Maybe it's not a problem. Tircha, a situation which involves much work, b'makom pseid. In a case of hefsid, mishamasli, where do we see that Rabbi Lezer would not allow that? So true, Rabbi Lezer apparently holds that the key is hefsid, but what about that second criterion? Minimal tircha. You don't see that anyway in Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov. Okay, so search is on. Who is the Tana of our Mishnah? Elamar of Papa. I found the Tana. Hamani Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda holds of both conditions. A, only in a makam of hefsid to avoid loss, and B, provided it doesn't involve much tircha. The Sanya. We're going to have a brisa with three shitas from one side of the spectrum to the other. You have a fresh spring. Mashkin mimenu afilu sadeh beis habal. The Rabbi Meir. Meir is not concerned with watering fields. Apparently, it's not much of a malacha, just watering. No problem at all. Chol HaMoed, be my guest. Go ahead, water any field, even a beis habal. You can use a fresh spring, no problem. Rabbi Yehuda takes the middle route. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, ein mashkin el sadeh beis hashalachan. Shecharva. You can only tend to a dry field, a desperate field, a thirsty field, a beis hashalachan which got destroyed, which lost its water source. Here we go. Rabbi Yehuda's shita is consistent with our Mishnah. You can do a malacha only to avoid hefsid. Rabbi Lezer and Zari Omer, loikach v'loikach. You know what? If it's a fresh spring, I'm concerned about collapse and extra work. Don't get involved in a fresh spring. Brisa continues. Yasser Akein Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda had another chumrah. Chumrah number one was, you can only water out of desperation in a Beis HaShalach. Number two, says Rabbi Yehuda, provided it does not involve too much involvement. You can't divert that stream to water his garden, his churva, ruined area which he replanted. So bottom line is, according to Rabbi Yehuda, avoid hefsed, yes, but only if it doesn't involve much tirch. Now, let's just go back for a second. Rabbi Yehuda spoke about a Beis HaShalach and shecharva. My charva, what does charva mean? Ilim charva mamish. His field got destroyed. It's over. Lamali the mashkala. Why is he watering a destroyed field, an abandoned field? Oh, no, buy it. It means like this. It's alive. It's growing. But it's missing its water. Shecharva mamayin zeh. He used to have a natural water source, a spring running to the field, and it dried up. V'yotz l'mayin achar. And now he's using another spring. So he can go ahead and do that because it's a Beis HaShalach. That's a third cheat. He's on the other side of the spectrum. He's the most machmer. Loikach v'loikach. Nor this nor that. What does that mean? Loishna charav ma'yona. Loishna loichayav ma'yona. It's irrelevant of whether he used to have a steady water supply and he lost it. It's charav ma'yona. In which case now he's desperate for water. Loishna loichayav ma'yona. Or whether his mayin wasn't destroyed, which means he doesn't need constant watering. So irrelevant of circumstance, whether it's a thirsty field, which was constantly watered up until this point, and somehow the mayin dried up, and now he's thirsty, or a field that didn't really need constant watering. Either way, mayon sheyotze b'tchilaloi. You can't go ahead and use a fresh spring. We're concerned about collapse and having to come back and reconstruct that area, which involves excessive tirch and chelamoid. So mayin sheyotze b'tchilaloi. So basically we have three shittas in the Brisa. From one side to the other, from one extreme to the other. Rabbi Meir says all watering is mutar and chelamoid, no concern whatsoever. Watering is not considered a malacha that we're concerned about. Rabbi Yehuda says, I don't want you to get involved in a fresh spring. Either way, don't water from this type of spring, which might lead to extra work. Might collapse, might have to come back and reconstruct it. Don't get involved. Rabbi Yehuda says, look, if it's a case of hefset, it's a Beis HaShalachin, you can go ahead and tend to it. Even using a fresh spring, we're not concerned about collapse. Provided you're not actually going ahead and doing an excessive tircha situation, like yifana adam amasamayim, that you can't do. So clearly, according to Rabbi Yehuda, you have to meet two conditions: A, hefset, to avoid loss, and B, no tircha. Says the Gemara, how do you know? How do you know that Rabbi Yehuda is consistent with our Mishnah? Dilma ad kan like Rabbi Yehuda Beis HaShalachin in Beis HaBaalai, perhaps. The only reason Rabbi Yehuda limited this heter, this allowance to water, he limited it to a Beis HaShalachin, to a thirsty field, but not a Beis HaBaal, an established field. Perhaps that's only because we're speaking about a fresh spring. Elamayan sheyotze b'tchila, a fresh spring. Where there's that concern of collapse, he says, you know what? If you're really desperate, then we take that chance. But otherwise, don't take a chance of collapse and having to rebuild it. Dilma aslan puli is a concern about collapse. So perhaps this restriction, this allowance to water only a Beis HaShalachin, is because it involves another concern of collapse. Aval mayan. But if it's a veteran stream, it's flowing for years, there's no concern of collapse. It's not going to collapse. Perhaps even a Beis HaBaal can be watered according to Rabbi Yehuda. When there's a compounded concern, there's also a concern of lin puli, which might involve extra work. Then he says, you know what? only if it's absolutely necessary, a beis hashalochen. But don't do it by a beis habal. But let's say it's a well-established stream which is not going anywhere. It's not falling apart. He's simply watering, perhaps. That would be allowed even if it's not absolutely desperate and necessary, even a beis habal. Says, well, if that's the case in Cain, if that would be Pran Rabbi Yehuda, Mas Nisan, Aman Termaye. Who would you attribute the Mishnah to? We had a Mishnah which gave us two conditions that have to be met. You can only water to avoid hefsid, and only if it doesn't involve excessive tircha. Now, if according to this kasha, Rabbi Yehuda would allow even in a beis habal, which is not a hefsid situation, then you wouldn't have a name, you wouldn't have a shita to connect the Mishnah to. And we assume if there's a discussion amongst Tanaim regarding setting forth guidelines of watering fields, and we have Rabbi Lezer, we have Rabbi Yehuda, we have many shitas, we don't find others discussing this topic. Apparently it's going to be one of these names. One of these Tanaim are going to be the author of our Mishnah. And we presume the closest one's Rabbi Yehuda. Ella, in fact, says the Gemara, let's summarize Rabbi Yehuda, Leish Lamayin, She'etz B'tchila. It's irrelevant of whether it's a fresh spring, or whether it's a mine that hadn't recently inaugurated, was an old spring, a veteran spring. Either way, you can water. Beis hashalochen in, beis habal lo, you can water a thirsty field to avoid hefsed, but not a beis habal, which doesn't necessarily need it right now. And in fact, that's consistent with our Mishnah that follows these two guidelines. Why didn't the Brisa discuss a recently flowing stream? According to Rabbi Yehuda, it's irrelevant of whether it's new or old. The answer is to highlight Rame's shita, who's matter in either case. Even a fresh spring, where there's that concern perhaps of collapse, Rabbi holds no concerns when it comes to watering. We allow watering, even a beis habal, even if it's a fresh spring. That's why the Brisa discusses a fresh spring. But of course, the same halacha applies to an old spring as well. Meaning, according to Rabbi Yehuda, whether it's fresh or old, it's only allowed to mokem hefsid in a beis hashalochen. So bottom line is we have how many shitas when it comes to watering on Chol Hamoed? 4 shitas. We started with Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov, who said you could transfer water from one tree to the other to keep the trees alive. But you can't water just a field which doesn't really need it. So according to Rabbi Lezer and Yaakov, it's allowed to mokem hefsid. But perhaps at the Gemara, even tircha would be allowed. It's not clear. According to Rameir, you can water anything, anytime. Let's just jump over to Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah. He says, only b'mokem hefsid, right, the beis hashalochen, without much tircha, and he limits it to a mayin yoshin. Right? He says you can only use an old, a veteran spring where there's no concern of collapse. So that doesn't work with our Mishnah. It would seem perhaps that he follows our Mishnah somewhat, only b'mokem hefsid without tircha, but he adds another condition. You can't use a fresh spring. So who's the Tana of our Mishnah that allows? That's Rabbi Yehuda, who says b'mokem hefsid, which means a beis hashalochen only, without much tircha. That's why he says you can't go divert streams. There can't be much tircha involved, and he allows any type of mayin, a mayin chadash, a mayin noshan. In fact, Rabbi Yehuda's shita is consistent, perfectly consistent with our Mishnah. Okay, says the Gemara. Let's start with a new topic. It's ma'wilat hamanachesh v'amashke mayim l'zroim b'Shabbos. Person weeds, he's manachesh, or he's mashke, he waters. He waters his plants on Shabbos. Which malach has he committed? Mishumay masrinam be. The Edom are observing it. They have to warn him. They have to give him a very precise warning. What are they going to tell him? What are you doing wrong? Let's go over to Rashi on the left. Mishumay masrinam be. Demay malacha kachashvina le. Weeding, watering. What exactly is it? Devade koitze lechashvina. You can't consider a manachesh as koitzer. Why? Kaitzer means to harvest. He's not trying to harvest. He's trying to clean out the field. He's trying to harvest the grass. He's trying to enhance the growth of the rest of the whatever's growing there. So that's not really kaitzer, which involves harvesting for personal use. Says Rashi, chayrish v'zereya, plowing, planting, kaitzer, and reaping avos melachos and perek algol. Those are the listed amongst the 39 avos melachos, the primary melachos which they use in the Mishkan. And those are the melachos which one must not do on Shabbos. Now Tosfos points out, what's the Gemara's shaila? Mishumay masrinam. So he says because a person cannot get an einish in bezin, whether it's malchus or misa, unless he's warned, and warned properly. They have to tell him, don't do chayrish, don't do kaitzer. They have to be very specific in their warning. Otherwise, it's meaningless. Tell me about one thing, I'm doing something else, it doesn't really connect, we don't relate to it. So back to the Gemara, what is Menachish and Zereh and Mashke? Which malach is it? It's not actually listed in the 39 of those malachas. So Machlikas, between Rabba and Rav Yosef. Rabba Amar Mishum Chayrish. It's a form of plowing. The Gemara will explain it. So you see a person doing Menachish or Mashke, tell him, don't do it, you're doing Charisha, which is an Av Malach on Shabbos. Rav Yosef Amar, it's not Chayrish. Mishum Zereya. It's a form of planting. What does this mean? Amar Rabba. Kavasedidi Mistabra. My approach, my opinion, that the Menachish and Mashke is a form of Chayrish seems to be plausible. Seems to be more probable than Rav Yosef's approach, that it's Zereya. Why? Ma darkech shel Chayrish l'fuyi ara. What is the purpose? What's the essence of Charisha? What's he doing when he's plowing? L'fuyi ara, to soften up, to loosen up the earth for planting. Hainami here as well, when he's weeding, when he's watering, what's he doing? He's loosening the earth. L'fuyi ara. And therefore, it belongs in that category. Menachish, Mashke is a form of Chayrish. Rav Yosef, my approach is more correct. Why? I maintain these belong in the Zereh category. What's the point of planting? To enable growth. To grow your crop. Hachanami here as well, weeding and watering is a catalyst for growth. Matzmach perior, activating the growth process of whatever it is that's growing there. Tosfos explains what's the machlekes. Rabbi looks at it from his perspective, loosening the earth. Rav Yosef says, look, what am I trying to do? Activate growth. It's like Zereya. Says Tosfos, a wonderful pshat. Two ways to look at everything. Practically, what is the practical form, the tangible form of what I'm doing? What is the activity involved? That's Rabbi's approach. Weeding, watering, is in effect loosening the earth. Let's look at what he's doing right now. That's synonymous with plowing, which loosens the earth. Therefore, he says it's a form of chayrish. Rav Yosef looks at the scheme, at the plan, the intent. What's my end goal? Not what I'm doing right now. What am I trying to achieve? When I weed, when I water, I'm trying to activate growth. It's like Zereya. I'm trying to matzmiach pera. And therefore it belongs in that category. So Rabbi looks at the practical side of things, and Rav Yosef looks at the intent, the plan, the goal. Amalei Abai, Rabbi. Abai turns to Rabbi. I have a double kasha. What is the kasha? Well, Rav Yosef kasha. I don't understand your shita or Rav Yosef. What is the kasha? I have a kasha on you. You say that mishum chayrish, it's connected to plowing. Mishum chayrish in, only chayrish. Mishum zirei, but not planting. Why not? True. I'm currently watering. I'm loosening, but I'm trying to achieve growth. You should have both elements, chayrish and zirei. That's one kasha. Rav Yosef kasha. Likewise, Rav Yosef have a kasha. Mishum zirei in mishum chayrish. Why is it only zirei but not chayrish? True. The end game is growth, but right now I'm trying to loosen the earth. Practically, I'm doing charish. So let it be both. Why does it have to be mutually exclusive? Why can't it be just both together? I'm doing two things wrong at once. I'm doing this ma'isa to achieve a certain result. Perhaps you'll say, when a ma'isa contains two elements, you can't be liable for two. There's only one chiv. That's not so. Rav Kahana tells us you can have double responsibility, double chiv in one ma'isa. For instance, Zoymer. He prunes his tree. He's trying to activate the tree, enhance the tzmich of the tree. B'tzorach le'etzim. He happens to need the wood, so he's actually harvesting wood as well. Chaim Shtaim, he's doing two things wrong. Achas b'shemnei te'ah, planting, he's enhancing the growth of that tree. V'achas b'shemnei koitzer, another chiyuv because he's harvesting. So one ma'isa could generate two results. Kasha, indeed, this is a kasha. We don't understand why it has to be one, not the other. Bottom line is, Rabbi says these things are connected to charisha, the practical aspect of what I'm doing, and Rabbi says it connects to Zriya, the results I'm trying to achieve. Eisvi Rav Yosef the Rabbi. So Rav Yosef, who says Zriya, asked the kasha of Rabbi who says charish. Like one weeds or covers over the seeds in a kalayim situation when he has two different varieties mixed together. Like he gets malchus. Not only if you actually do a masa do you get malchus, even if it's just maintaining kilayim. He sees kilayim growing in his field, leaves it alone. He's also chayiv malchus. So this is a tesefta in kilayim. Says Rav Yosef, Bishleima liditi. According to me, it's perfect. I say that weeding is a form of planting. Of course he gets malchus. I'll plant kilayim. But according to you, weeding is a form of plowing. What's wrong with plowing? He's not actually planting the kilayim, just plowing the area. That's not a problem. Why is he getting malchus? No, he gets malchus. Not because he's actually plowing. That masa doesn't generate malchus. Because he's maintaining his kilayim. He sees it right there and he's leaving it there. Like Rabbi Kiva says, Mekayim gets malchus. 1 second. But this is Tanakama, not Rabbi Kiva. If you take a look at the Sefer, we see Rabbi Kiva holds that way. Rabbi Kiva, Mekayim, even maintaining generates malchus. Mechlal, apparently, the Tanakama, Lavish Mekayim. Apparently, Tanakama is not based on Mekayim. He doesn't hold of Mekayim. Rather, he's guilty because he did something, a masa. So according to me, weeding is zirei, he did something wrong. According to you, it's only charisha. Why would he get malchus? Kula Rabbi Kiva, the whole bryce is Rabbi Kiva, from beginning to end. And it's based on the concept of Mekayim. Umatam Ka'amar. We're just explaining ourselves. We start, the Menachi, Shemachapa gets malchus. Why? It's just charisha. Matam ha-Menachi, Shemachapa b'kalayim loikim, Shemachayim. Because he's maintaining his kalayim, not because he did something wrong, because he's maintaining it in place. And it's all Rabbi Kiva speaking. Share Rabbi Kiva Omer, because we know Rabbi Kiva holds Af HaMekayim, even Mekayim gets malchus. So he authored the entire price. My tender Rabbi Kiva. Why does Rabbi Kiva say Mekayim gets malchus? He didn't do anything wrong. The Sanya, Brisa says, Sadchale Sizr Kalayim. Don't plant Kalayim in your field. We learn, perhaps only an actual Zayreya gets malchus. Mekayim Minayim. What about just leaving it in place, ignoring it? Tamalay Kalayim Sadchalei, we darshan that you can't have Kalayim in this field. Eradicate Kalayim. Mekayim itself generates malchus. Continues the Gemara. Let's go back to our Mishnah. Tanan. Mash can base hashalochen b'moed b'shvius. A lot of water on Chol Hamoed and on Shemitah. Bishlam in Moed, we just explained, Barichas, why it's mutar on Chol Hamoed. Mishum tirchu, the concern is exertion. Umakam pseid lo sharabanon. The whole concept of Melach on Chol Hamoed is diversion, is tircha, but in a makam pseida, to avoid financial loss, to save that field, you can do it. Sharabon, Rabban allowed. Okay. So we understand Chol Hamoed. Ela Shvius, what about a Shemitah? How can you water on Shemitah? Whether it's according to Rav Yosef that watering is Zereya, whether according to Rabbah that it's a form of Charisha. These are malachis. Zriya v'charisha b'shvis mishari. Since when can you do malachis on Shemitah? You can't work the field on Shemitah. How can the Mishnah allow watering on Shemitah? Amar Abaye, b'shvis b'zman hazeh v'Rebbe. You know what the Mishnah is speaking about? B'zman hazeh, nowadays. When Klal Yisrael and non-Eretz Yisrael, and the concept of Yovel doesn't exist, which is something that's dependent upon the presence of Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, Shemitah is also something which doesn't really apply in Torah because it's dependent on Yovel. B'zman hazeh, Shemitah is milim d'Rabbanan. Rebbe, you follow Shitas Rebbe, the Sanya. Rebbe Yomer, v'zer dvar Shemitah. This is the topic, the concept of Shemitah, Shamit, abandon. So what's the redundancy? Is that dvar Shemitah, Shamit? We learned that there are two types of Shemitah. B'shtei Shemitah hakasav medaber. Two aspects, two mitzvahs to fulfill on Shemitah. Achas Shemitah's karka, abandon the karka, don't work the fields. V'achas Shemitah's ksofim, abandon your claims on your friend. Let go of your loans. Relinquish the chayvos. And the pasuk connects the two things. Shemitah's karka with Shemitah's ksofim, and we learn Bizman shatam meshamet karka, when Yovel is active, when Klal Yisrael is in Eretz Yisrael, and there's Yovel, and therefore there's Shemitah as well. So it's one package. Atam meshamet ksofim, you have to let go of those loans. Whereas man she'atam meshamet karka, but nowadays when there's no Yovel and there's no Shemitah in Torah, you don't have to let go of those loans. Explains Rashi. Apparently, it's pretty clear from Rebbe's words that there was a point in history, there was a time where there was no Shemitah's karka. How could that be? Because Shemitah's karka is dependent upon Yovel, which doesn't exist today. So according to Rebbe, Shemitah's ksafim is dependent on Shemitah's karka, which is dependent on Yovel, which doesn't exist today. So according to Abaye, we're speaking Bezman Hazeh, it's only the Rabbanon. And Rabbanan say, look, b'makam hefsid, it's based on shalochan, you lose your field, lose your crop, go ahead and water, despite the fact that it's a form of zereya or cherish, depending on the shittas. Rav Amma, afilu teim Rabbanan. Our Mishnah could follow even shittas Rabbanan who disagreed with Rebbe. They hold that even b'zman hazeh Shemitah is minat Torah. So how could you water on Shemitah? Avos asar rachmana, toldos le'asar rachmana. You know which malachas are asar on Shemitah? Only of its primary malachas. Rashi says those malachas which are listed on that 39 malachas list, malachas that were executed in the Mishkan, those are considered avos, primary malachas, but teilades, derivatives, secondary malachas like watering, although it's a pretty important thing, but it wasn't something that they did in the Mishkan, it's not called an av, and lo asar rachmana. There's no isser min Torah to do these things on Shemitah. As the Gemara will continue by Hashem in tomorrow's daf, based on psukim. In any case, since it's not asam Torah, it's only the Rabbanon. In the case of hefsid, Rabbanon allowed it on Shemitah. Okay, let's do a brief chazar of today's daf. Which malachas are mutar and chol hamoed? Rashi brings the Gemara Chagiga and explains that Hashem was moiseh l'chachamim. He allowed the chachamim to set forth the criterions, the guidelines of what is done, what is not, and according to our Mishnah, you have to meet two conditions. Menias hefsid, avoid financial loss without much tircha. We have the Beis HaShalachan, which is the mishalhi, the tired, the thirsty field. Beis HaBaal, which is a more established field. Mishnah says, in the Beis HaShalachan, which needs constant watering, can do it if it's minimal tircha. Who is the mandam of our Mishnah? We have four shittas: Rabbi Yaakov, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Azariah. The Gemara concludes that Rabbi Yehuda's shita is the closest to our Mishnah. He requires hefsid, requires no tircha, and he allows even using a mayan chadash. What about menachesh and mashke, weeding, watering? What malacha does that entail? Rabbi says cherish, loosening the earth. Rabbi Yosef says, look at the goal. What are you trying to achieve? You're trying to activate growth. That's a malacha of zireya. You can't do nichush by kilayim. So says the Brisa. We have two pshatim. Either like Rabbi Yosef, because menachesh is a form of zireya, which is also by kilayim. Or even according to Rabbah, that it's just a form of charisha which wouldn't be us by kilayim. The brisa follows Rabbi Kiva that mekayim kilayim is also like. This explains cholamoid. What about watering on Shemitah? How could the Mishnah allow that on Shemitah? It's a malacha. Two terutzim. Bizman hazeh, it's only d'Rabbanan. Or teilades. Amotim and ator only osam d'Rabbanan. And amakim hefsid, chachamim allowed. All the best to you and much, much hatzlacha.